Thesk, a small agricultural nation benefiting from the Golden Way, a prominent trade route that connects Faerun with Kara-Tur. It is located in the region of Faerun known as the Unapproachable East, a land also occupied by Aglarond, Rashomon, and Thay. Thesk's main revenue is from farming and providing services to travelers along the Golden Way. Their business is business. They are ruled by merchant princes, and they are a place where race, bloodline, and other social statuses are close to meaningless, with wealth being the only thing that matters. Thesk has no official capital, since they're a confederation of allied city-states as opposed to a unified nation. Now, in the 1350s DR, Milvaroon did sort of act as its capital. Then after that, Telflam was the de facto capital for several years before it lost that status as the other towns of Thesk grew into bigger cities to rival it. And then in the 1370s, Phasant was sort of the closest thing to a capital, since that's where the Merchant Council met. But it never truly had an official capital. Their population, as of 1372 DR, was around 850,000, with humans making up 85%, gnomes 8%, orcs 6%, and then everything else 1%. Their form of government is an oligarchy. Each town is led by a merchant council consisting of the wealthiest members of that town, and then each council sends a representative to be part of the Council of Thesk. The most commonly worshipped gods are Shantia, Mask, Shandakul, and Joaquin. Their main imports are gold, horses, and trade goods, and their main exports are food, gnome goods, iron, and Kara-Turin goods. And then the overall alignment of the location is neutral, neutral good, and chaotic good. Now, before we talk about the rest of Thesk, we need to discuss what Thesk is most famous for: the Golden Way. This is a trade route that connects Faerun with the continent of Kara-Tur to the east. It starts in Telflam, travels through every important city in Thesk, and dead ends into Lake Mulsantir, where travelers take ferries into the Rashomon town, Mulsantir, and then continues along through the endless waste and into Kara-Tur. The Golden Way is a major trade route and is the primary reason Thesk is able to stand as an independent country, as opposed to being part of the Great Dale or another Tharsh of Thay. Geography. Thesk is bordered by the Easting Reach and Impiltur to the west, the Easting Reach being the northeastern part of the Sea of Fallen Stars, the Sea of Dlurg and Aglarond to the south, Rashomon and Thay to the east, and the Great Dale to the north. Most of the region consists of vast stretches of uninhabited lands, with elevation gradually increasing as one moves east. The Thesk Mountains. These are a low, rugged, scrub-covered mountain range in the center of the country, and is where the country gets its name. The mountains stretch over 100 miles east-west and are said to be inhospitable due to being dry and infertile. They are not super high, with the tallest mountain only 7,000 feet in altitude, but they are steep and difficult to scale, and lethal landslides are common. All sorts of creatures live here, but the most common are orcs, thanks to the orc army the Zentarum sent here to combat the Tuigan horde. Most of them work in mines scattered throughout the Thesk Mountains and come down to Phasant to blow off steam when they've acquired enough funds. Within the Thesk Mountains, there are three notable locations: Hilltown, Mount Nurg, and Fort Thesk. Hilltown is a small community of around 40 hill giants in the northeastern foothills of the Thesk Mountains. They live with direwolves, ogres, and orcs, but the arrangement is unstable and often results in fighting. They hunt and gather, but their favorite meals are the humanoids traveling the Golden Way. They don't do this too often though, because the Shadow Masters of Telflam will punish overindulgence. As of 1372 DR, they stick to harassing travelers on the path from Fent to Nethentir. They never raid a caravan with a red wizard or someone bearing the mark of the Shadow Masters. Mount Nurg is the tallest of the Thesk Mountains. Quote, Mount Nurg is a rampart of barren rock and loose, gravelly slopes that winds almost 10 miles through the eastern reaches of the range. Its lower reaches are littered with hundreds of ancient tombs and the remnants of old stone roads built by some folk lost to history, and the mountain itself has an even worse reputation than the rest of this bleak range. End quote. Halfway between the Thesk Mountains and Thay Mount in the Underdark lies the drow city of Fon de Kolzan, which is a part of the confederation of drow cities Undrek Thaz. They have an outpost and a high rocky tor near the summit of Mount Nurg. It is almost impossible to reach without flying. The drow use a spiral of seemingly endless staircases that spiral up through the mountain. They monitor the movements of red wizards on the path between Nethentyr and Fint. No one knows why they care about the red wizards' movements, but some people in Telflam believe they are waiting for Thay to launch an all-out attack against someone, and then attempt to take Thaymount for themselves while the wizards have their forces elsewhere. Fort Thesk. Thay and Thesk have fought over control of the Thesk Mountains for years. While Thay has never completely taken over them or held much ground for long, they have set up outposts and fortifications. Fort Thesk is one of those on the far eastern edge of the range. It served as a watchtower ensuring Theskians didn't try to take their territory back, but one day all the Thayans there disappeared with no signs of struggle, and no one is sure what happened. Next up in Thay's geography is the Ashenath. The Ashenath are high, windswept plains leading up to Lake Ashani, forming the eastern border of Thesk. It is almost entirely uninhabited by humanoids despite its potential to be the most fertile land in all the unapproachable East. This is because it is plagued by monstrous windstorms and cyclones all year long, a consequence of the Red Wizards magically moderating the climate on the plateau of Thay. Tornadoes are sometimes as often as once a 10-day, although they rarely reach the Golden Way. Theskian druids have cast detection spells on large boulders strewn throughout the plains of the Ashenath, giving them a limited awareness of when the storms are active. The plains are grassy with rich dark soil and roamed by small herds of oxen and ponies. Now the Ashenath is mostly uninhabited, but there are actually two towns here, Kront and Two Stars. Powerful storms do hit them at least once or twice a year, but every building is equipped with cellars to take shelter in. On the shores of Lake Ashani, 20 miles north of Kront, lies the ruins of Shandalar, locally known as the City of Weeping Ghosts. Shandalar was the capital of the petty Nar kingdom of Ashenath. It was destroyed by the Nintiarch of Theros, later called Narfell, in the process of unifying all the Nar people. The place is haunted by many dangerous undead, including at least one Nightshade. It housed a portal to the Council Hills in the Eastern Shar, where an expansion of the city called Southern Shandalar resided, although I'm not sure if the portal is still working. Then we have the Dragonjaw Mountains. They are the southwestern border of Thesk, stretching from the Umber Marshes west into the Sea of Fallen Stars. They are steep mountains, rising quickly from the northern foothills and dropping off even quicker south into the Sea of Dlurg. The River Umber cuts a divide into the mountains called the Tanath Gap, and the tip of the western peninsula is known as Cape Dragonfang and is used as a navigational point by sailors of the Inner Sea. The only settlement here is Milvaroon, right at the bottom of a steep and narrow pass that cuts through the thinnest part of the range and on the shores of the Sea of Dlurg. Dozens of rock gnome clans live here on terraces they built into the steeps of the slopes, trading precious gems they've mined to Milvaroon or Fint in exchange for food and goods they can't get in the mountains. They are reclusive, hiding from humans they don't know until they are sure they mean no harm. Any human with red clothing are distrusted, and if they have a bald head as well, they hide from them no matter what. If they are bald and tattooed, they are likely to ambush them on sight, fearful of the Thayans. Within the Dragonjaw Mountains, there are two notable locations, the Dragon's Tooth and the Old Swords. The Dragon's Tooth is the westernmost mountain of Cape Dragonfang. It has a purplish peak that can be spotted by sailors 100 miles out to sea. Pirates avoid the Sea of Dlurg because the symbol has declared piracy punishable by immediate death, and because a family of copper dragons live on the Dragon's Tooth and frequently rescue ships being plundered by corsairs. The patriarch of this copper dragon family is Philoxerimos, a chaotic good male worm copper dragon level 8 bard who is said to have called upon celestial beings to build a dragon castle near the peak of the Dragon's Tooth. Every spring, the town of Milvaroon celebrates Dragon Day, where they have a riddle contest between the gnomes and the dragons. The Old Swords. This is a peak that overlooks the Tanath Gap at the eastern end of the northern range. The mountain splits into two rocky piers that jut 1,000 feet high. In the cleft between these two pillars, as of 1372, lives a tribe of evil dragonkin that capture humanoids and sacrifice them to Tiamat. History of Thesk. Now, in order to understand what I'm about to talk about, I do need to give you a little bit of prerequisite knowledge. So, from around -900 DR to -150 DR, there were two empires that existed in the area of present-day Thesk, Rashomon, Narfell, Thay, the Endless Waste, and around that area. the Empire of Narfel to the west, and the Empire of Ramathar to the east, and they frequently fought over territory. In the decade between -160 and -150, the Narfeli unleashed the demon lord Eltab and an army of demons to fight the Ramvirans, while the Ramvirans summoned an avatar of Kosith, the god of fire, to fight back. Kosith annihilated both armies, leaving Narfel and Ramathar defenseless. The remaining demons and other summoned beings rampaged through both countries, destroying any living creatures they could find. This was known as the Great Conflagration and ended the Narfel and Ramathar empires. Now with that out of the way, let's discuss the origin of Thesk. According to 3rd edition, the land of Thesk was at one time ruled by the Empire of Narfel, but after the Great Conflagration, little survived and remained mostly emptied until 917, when the Impilturan merchant Wyndon Belindre settled the land and pioneered the Golden Way trade route. Belindre founded the city of Telflam in 926, and the country of Thesk was founded by the Alliance of the Cities of the Golden Way in 937, becoming independent from Impiltur. According to the 1st edition book Dreams of the Red Wizards, the area of Thesk, which mainly consisted of inns and trading stations along the Golden Way, was originally controlled by Ramathar, and the Golden Way trade route already existed. After the Great Conflagration, it was briefly controlled by Mulhorand, but eventually the Confederation of Cities banded together, named themselves Thesk after the mountain range, and drove out the Mulhorandi tax collectors, becoming independent. As you can see, there are some inconsistencies between these. So to recap, there were 4 main ones that I found. First, in 3rd edition, the area of Thesk was largely uninhabited after -150, and then was settled in 917, while in 1st edition, inns and trading stations existed under Mulhorand's control during that time. 2, in 3rd edition, the Golden Way wasn't established until 917, while in 1st edition, it already existed in the days of the Ramathar Empire, and the Ramathar Empire existed from -900 to -150. 3, in 3rd edition, the region of Thesk used to be controlled by the Ramathar Empire, and then later became an Impilturan province, while in 1st edition, it was under the Narfel Empire in the past, and later became a Mulhorandi province. 4, in 3rd edition, it became an independent country in 937. In 1st edition, no date is given as to when it gained independence, but it does say that it was controlled by Mulhorand after Ramathar fell in -150, and that Mulhorand only held it briefly. I wouldn't consider 1100 years as brief, so presumably it was declared independent much earlier than 937. Now, I think this can be reconciled. 3rd edition says there wasn't much in the area after the Great Conflagration, but not that there wasn't anything at all. So there could have been some inns and trading stations that Mulhorand claimed, just not much else. Eventually, those people overthrew the Mulhorandi tax collectors and named the region Thesk after the mountains, but they weren't a country yet. It isn't until Belindre settles the area that it becomes an official government body, also named Thesk after the name of the region. The fact that one edition says it belonged to Narfel and the other says it was controlled by Ramathar is easily explained by the fact that both empires frequently fought each other over territory, so the land of Thesk could have been under both empires' control at different times in history. The Golden Way might have already existed during ancient Ramathar and Narfel, but I would assume it fell into disuse after the Great Conflagration. So when 3rd edition says Belindre pioneered the Golden Way, it could just mean he reestablished the trade route and got it going again, not that he was the first one to use it. That's my best attempt at explaining the differences between 1st and 3rd edition. A key point that got pointed out to me by George Krashos on the Ed Grima Discord server is not to confuse the region of Thesk with the country of Thesk. I think 1st edition was talking about the region, whereas 3rd edition was talking about the actual country. Now, other than the origin of Thesk, there's really only one other important moment in history within the country, and that is the Tuigan Horde. Or maybe it's pronounced the Tugan Horde, or the Tuigan. I'm not really sure how to pronounce it. I looked it up online, and according to Google Translate, it is a real word in Hungarian, and it's pronounced Tuigan.
Tuigan. Tuigan.
So I'm gonna go with that because it sounds kind of cool, but I really don't know how to pronounce this. So the Tuigans were a tribe of nomadic horse-riding humans in the Endless Waste. But the term Tuigan was eventually used to refer to all 15 tribes of that region when they were united under one lord, Yamun Kahan, in 1359. This was called the Grand Army of the Tuigan, or commonly as the Tuigan Horde, and began invading westward until they were defeated at Phasant, a city in Thesk, in 1360 by King Azun IV of Cormyr, leading an alliance of nations from throughout Faerun. One of the factions that lent aid was the Zentarum that sent an army of orcs. The people of Thesk. Quote, although Thesk is populated mostly by humans, it is still the most racially diverse nation in the unapproachable East. Gold is the great equalizer here. No matter who a person is or what she may have done, her fortune speaks louder than all else. The people of Thesk respect those of wealth, especially those lucky or talented souls who earned their wealth with their own hard work and ingenuity. End quote. Thesk is described as a melting pot, so let's dive into the races and cultures that are most prevalent here. First up, we have the Damarans. Most humans in Thesk are of the Damaran ethnicity. Since Thesk was originally settled by Impiltur in the early 900s, and most Impilturans are of Damaran ethnicity. However, the Damarans of Thesk have been mingling with Rashami for a long time, so Theskians show signs of both Damaran and Rashami blood. The Shu. Shu humans hail from the Empire of Shu Lung in Karatur. Most of them came here as slaves of the Tuigan Horde or refugees running away from said horde, and others came on trade caravans along the Golden Way and decided to stay. Shu have become fairly commonplace in Thesk, and many of them congregate in their own districts called Shu towns. Tuigan. After the defeat of the Tuigan Horde, not all of them went home. Many of them were pressed into service and didn't care when it was defeated, and they traded in their soldier's life for a peaceful existence in Thesk. And others wished to continue their violent ways, since they knew no other way of life, and they just became brigands within Thesk. Orcs and half-orcs. The Zentarum came to the aid in the battle against the Tuigan Horde, sending an army of orcs. After the battle was won, the Zents left their orc units stationed in Thesk, and they slowly assimilated into the country, one of the few nations tolerant of their kind. So other than those main ones, we have several other races that can be found within Thesk. One of them is halflings, well, sort of. According to page 186 of Unapproachable East, it says that most characters from Thesk are, quote, humans, halflings, or half-orcs, although a number of gnomes inhabit the Dragonjaw Mountains, end quote. But I can't find any mentions of halflings in Thesk anywhere else in this book, or any D&D book for that matter. However, in Dragon Magazine 269, page 84, it does say that there is a town north of Telflam called Ethdale that is dominated by halflings. So this must be where the Theskian halflings come from. Still, according to Unapproachable East, halflings would make up less than 1% of the population of Thesk, so it still seems strange to say that most characters from Thesk are humans, halflings, or half-orcs. I feel like the halflings should be switched with gnomes. Other than that, bands of gnolls from the Plateau of Thay sometimes wander down into Thesk, and they take up work as sellswords. There are also plenty of monsters in Thesk. Most of them are from the labs of Thay, such as blood orcs, dread warriors, and juju zombies. And then you also have hagspawn and spirit folk in the Ashenath, as it borders Roshaman, where they're from. You also have elves from the forests of Lethir and Goliaths from the Thesk Mountains that have also settled within the country. Now let's discuss the languages of Thesk. According to the 2nd edition Dragon Magazine article, Speaking in Tongues, written by Tom Costa, Theskians speak a language called Elysian. However, Elysian is never mentioned anywhere else in Dungeons & Dragons sources. 3rd edition's Player's Guide to Faerun retcons this and states that instead, Theskians speak Damaran, which is the language of Damara. Personally, I defer to the Tom Costa article because it is extremely detailed and convoluted, which makes the realms feel more real, since real life is extremely detailed and convoluted. I think 3rd edition was trying to simplify languages a little bit to make learning the lore a little easier, but I do find it odd that Thesk and Impiltur speak the same language as Damara, since neither of their origins are related to Damara as far as I can tell. However, it is a nearby country, so it's not crazy to think that they adopted their language. To reconcile this discrepancy, the way I see it is Elysian is the language of Thesk, while Damaran is a common language for merchants to learn when doing business with other traders from the Cold Lands. Now, common, the language, exist for this exact purpose, doing business with people from other countries who don't speak your native language. However, as of the late 1300s, Common was merely a trade language, a slightly more evolved pidgin tongue. It was used for simple conversations, but nuances of speech, naming, and phrasing were all better suited for other languages, so I could see Damaren being used in its place. However, as of the late 1490s DR, Common has evolved into a full-fledged language, so I imagine the use of Damaren as a trade language would have died down. Now, all of this is just my headcanon and conjecture, so don't take this to heart. Canonically, the only thing I know is that Elysian was the language of Thesk in 2nd edition, and then 3rd edition retconned it into Damaren. Architecture and fashion. Now, D&D, well, at least older editions of D&D, did a fantastic job of giving you tons of lore and detail on what a specific location is like. However, one of the things I've noticed it doesn't really do a great job at is the visual description. What is the architecture like? What do the buildings look like? What do their clothes look like, etc.? Now, they do have artwork of different locations, and that conveys some of it, but in terms of the actual text of the books, they never really explain it. So, let's look at the artwork to get a feel for what Thesk looks like. So in this image, we have a city skyline where the main building and several towers have onion domes. Now, in universe, this is the same architectural style that the neighboring country Thay uses in many of their cities. And I also believe Murgam and Simfar also use onion domes, although those are two countries that also don't get as much love as they should. In real life, this style is most well known for its use in Russian Orthodox churches, but they're also used in South Asia and parts of the Middle East. Now, this image gives you a tiny bit of buildings, pretty basic rectangular buildings with flat roofs that could be based off a dozen different real-life cultures, but it definitely isn't typical Western European medieval fantasy. And then you also get lots of colorful cloths on decorating the tables, and everyone's clothes seem to be wildly different. See, as I've mentioned a million times in this video, Thesk is a melting pot. It has a major trade route where people from all over the planet pass through and spread their culture. So you can honestly get away with depicting it as anything. If I were running a D&D session in Thesk, I would make sure to play up the diversity. Don't have a common type of clothing be prevalent or popular. Have dozens of different styles everywhere you look. No two people in Thesk should look similar. In this picture, you have... well, I honestly don't know what I would call the architecture or the clothing style. In the building in the background, you do have like the typical medieval village pointy roof with a chimney. And then the building in the foreground has a grass roof, so maybe there's some Rashmi style architecture influence in there. But I'm not a cultural expert. I'm just relying on Wikipedia and Dungeons and Dragons knowledge, so everything I'm saying might be completely useless. And then I don't really know what the clothes are, but they're fun and they're different. Life in society. Thesk is all about business. There are a few farms along the Golden Way and mines in the mountains, but their main focus is, quote, commerce, shipping, and catering to the caravans along the main trade routes. Wealth is the means to power, station, and comfort in Thesk, end quote. The ones with the most power are the wealthiest. These are the merchant lords, or oligarchs, that control the great merchant houses and caravans bound for the lands beyond the endless waste. The wealthy do not look down on the farmers, laborers, and craftsmen. They see governing as their, quote, responsibility imposed by success and rarely seek to do anything more than discharge his duties in the quickest and most efficient manner possible, end quote. Theskians are always ready with a kind word and an open palm, accepting payment for any service rendered. Most of them are always on the prowl for the next big deal, and to them, it's not who you are that matters, but what you're worth. Many might view their commercialism as crass, but they are some of the most open-minded people in all of Faerun. They didn't discriminate against the Zintish orcs, but instead saw them as valuable resources. Economy. Since Thesk serves as the gateway between Karatur and Faerun, it is one of the wealthiest countries in the east, and its economy is focused on trade. Dozens of large trading costers and hundreds of minor entrepreneurs invest thousands of gold pieces into buying Faerunian goods and then organizing caravans to sell these goods at a premium in Karatur. Then they reinvest the money in silk, spices, and exotic goods to bring back to Thesk and sell to other merchants of the Inner Sea. An investment of 100 gold pieces can net 500 gold pieces of exotic goods, but the trip takes a year and can be dangerous. Law and order. Crime and disorder is bad for business, so the Merchants' Council hires a city watch to enforce a code of laws that protect people and property. However, there is barely any regulation of business practices, so merchants bribing the clerks of competitors for information, charging usurious rates for money lending, and paying marauders in the endless waste to attack rival caravans are all too common in Thesk. Defense and warcraft. To quote an old Theskian maxime, war is bad for business for everyone but the gravediggers. Thesk is a mercantile place. They are not a warlike people and have never mounted an invasion of anyone. However, they know their wealth makes them a target, so they invest heavily in defenses. Most merchants hire large numbers of personal loyal guards. Thesk lacks a national army, relying instead on the cities of Faerun, Nith, Phsant, and Telflam to maintain small, professional forces supported by disciplined mercenary companies. These mercenaries follow strict, long-standing rules prohibiting dishonorable actions, such as switching sides mid-conflict or demanding extra payment to fight. It is tradition for these companies to negotiate with each other before battles, where each side observes the display of force from the other, and the captains determine who would have likely won. This results in conflicts being resolved without even engaging in combat, but instead decided by a martial parade. The cities of Thesk stand together in a defensive league. An attack on any of them would result in retaliation from all. They might not have much of a martial tradition, but they can hire a lot of help and throw in well-armed militia if necessary. Religion. Theskians tend to be quite generous with their donations to churches. Joaquin, Tamora, and Shandakul are all popular here since they oversee commerce, fortune, and travel respectively. Those who wish to get ahead by any means are drawn towards Cyric, but few Theskians openly worship evil gods, and almost all Theskians indirectly contribute to the Priest of Mask by allowing the Shadow Masters a cut of their earnings, whether voluntarily or not. Adventurers are welcome in Thesk, as there's always dangerous work to be done, such as investigating ancient ruins or protecting a trade caravan, and there's never enough willing to do it for a fair price. Theskians remember the role of adventurers when fending off the Tuigan horde, and so they are well respected here. Government. Thesk isn't a single unified realm, but a league of allied city-states. The first edition book Dreams of the Red Wizards says the government is, quote, an oligarchy made up of the rulers of the trading cities along the Golden Way, end quote. And 3rd edition's Forgotten Realms campaign setting says each city is ruled by a mayor who is always the wealthiest inhabitant. Now, both of these are stating that each city is ruled by a single ruler. However, the 3rd edition book Unapproachable East says something different. It says each town is actually ruled by a council. Now, since Dreams of the Red Wizards and the 3rd edition Forgotten Realms campaign setting both only have 1 or 2 sentences about the government of Thesk, whereas the Unapproachable East goes into much more detail and has entire paragraphs on the government, it was released more recently, and its lore is consistent with the way Thesk's government is described in later sources. I'm going to defer to the Unapproachable East's entry for this video. However, they're easy to reconcile. It could be that they have both. They have the Council of Merchants, but they also have a mayor who's sort of the head of the council. So, according to Unapproachable East, each town and city is governed by a council of merchants. The council members are selected based on business success and personal wealth, always consisting of the richest inhabitants. The prerequisites to be considered a potential member vary from city to city, but the minimum is ownership or control of property and enterprises worth 10,000 gold pieces in a small town up to 100,000 gold pieces in a large city such as Telflam. The head of each of these merchant councils represents the town at the Council of Thesk. Faerun and Telflam were represented by their princes, but these nobles wielded no more power than the leading merchants of other cities. The Council of Thesk meet once a year, or when events demand, to discuss issues of mutual import. Quote, the council oversees no administration, commands no army, and has no responsibilities or authority other than the voluntary contributions of its member cities, end quote. Thesk does not have a capital city, although Phsant is usually where the council meets as it is a central location. According to 3rd edition, Telflam was the de facto capital for many years, but it lost that status as the other towns of Thesk grew into bustling cities. According to 1st edition, Faerun acted as its capital. Point is, it doesn't have a capital. According to 4th edition, Thesk had a suzerain based in Phasant from 1400 to 1453, but after his death, Thesk returned to a divided land of feuding merchants. If you're like me and had no idea what a suzerain was, it's basically a type of sovereign that controls the councils and foreign policies of its tributary states, but otherwise allows them complete autonomy. Technically, as of 1479, Thesk still had a suzerain, but they were weak with little power and they left the Council of Thesk alone. The presence of a suzerain sort of implies that Thesk was united, at least more so than it used to be, because that implies that it had some sort of central authority as opposed to just random council members. But whether they still had the Council of Thesk during that time, and how much power the council had versus the suzerain is very uncertain. This info is from 2 paragraphs from the 4th edition Forgotten Realms campaign guide, so it's very vague and does not go into the various implications. Now, in addition to the merchants' councils, the Council of Thesk, the princes, the suzerains, and all of that convoluted nonsense, you also have the Shadow Masters. The Shadow Masters are a thieves guild based out of Telflam, and they control or influence the merchants' council of almost all towns and cities in Thesk. Through bribery, corruption, or intimidation, they bring many of the ruling merchants to agree with their point of view. They, quote, oppose steps to unite Thesk, establish central authority, or introduce accountability over the merchants' councils. But other than that, they leave the oligarchs to run the country as they like, end quote. It is an open secret within Telflam that the Shadow Masters run the city. Most people don't mind though, as they do a better than average job of running things. They have their hands in every business in the city. Racketeering, prostitution, drugs, extortion, murder, and other fouler practices. Everybody in Telflam, either directly or indirectly, work for the Shadow Masters, whether they know it or not. Quote, the Shadow Masters realize they need the acquiescence of the people to maintain their position. They are careful not to skim too much off the various operations they set up, for if they make the cost too onerous, they're sure to end up with a revolt on their hands. It's a lot better for profit margins to extort money from people who don't find it worthwhile to fight back. End quote. Of course, good aligned people are always trying to free the city from the grip of thieves. The Shadow Masters worship Mask, the god of shadows and thieves, at least up through 3rd edition. According to the Forgotten Realms wiki, in 1374, Mask relinquished his divinity and his life over to Shar to repay a millennia-old debt to the goddess. Because of this, the Shadow Masters worshipped Shar as of 1478 DR in 4th edition. I don't really understand why or how Mask did this. I think he turned out to be Shar's son, but I couldn't really find an explanation as to like how that came about. This sentence on the wiki doesn't have a source for some reason. I believe this is a plot point from a novel series I haven't read, so maybe if you've read that, it makes more sense. So yeah, they worshipped Shar in 4th edition. Now in 5th edition, I have absolutely no info on Thesk other than 2 paragraphs in the Sword Coast Adventures guide that just says some basic information that I've already talked about. However, since Mask is back in 5th edition, I assume that the Shadow Masters would go back to worshipping him instead. However, I could see there being some disagreements and conflict within the organization between the Mask followers and the Shar followers. That could be an interesting plot hook for a campaign where there's a schism within the Shadow Masters. Now, in addition to the Shadow Masters, there's one other faction that's sort of very important to the country of Thesk in terms of their relationship with them, because they're kind of an enemy, but they're also a useful trade partner, and that is Thay. Thay has always coveted Thesk's easy access to the rest of Faerun and Karatur, and have mounted invasions of Thesk plenty of times. They conquered Nethjet and Nethentir from Thesk in 1068, but they've been unable to extend farther north or west. Part of this is because if they did conquer Thesk, they would have exposed flanks to Rashomon and Aglarond. As of 1372, Thesk was on relatively friendly terms with Thay. Multiple Red Wizard trade enclaves existed in Thesk, and Theskian merchants were happy to buy Thayan goods and sell them for profits to other countries that dislike supporting the economy of a slaver nation. Settlements. Much of Thesk consists of open plains, rugged mountains, and dense forests, with most settlements located along major trade routes connecting the Eastern Reach to Rashomon and Thay. The cities focus on trade and providing services to those involved in trade rather than industry. These cities are generally unwalled, with wooden buildings stacked tightly to be near commercial hubs. Normally, this type of crowding would result in filthy cities, but the merchant councils invest in keeping the streets clean to attract more business. Faerun, a small southern coastal city surrounded by mountains on three sides and the Sea of Dlurg on the other. Most people coming and going go by sea, since foot travel to the city is arduous through the mountains. Like Telflam, Faerun is an independent principality governed by a prince. It is only loosely affiliated with Thesk and has been ruled by the Midosel family for centuries. It is the most cosmopolitan of Thesk's cities. Besides humans, the population consists of gnomes from the mountains and half-elves from Aglarond. Every spring, they celebrate Dragon Day, where they have a riddle contest between the gnomes and the copper dragons of the Dragonjaw Mountains. Nith. Nith is the weaker sister city to Telflam. Isolated by the forests of Lethir and the river Flam, Nith never became the major port town which Telflam turned into, so for most of its existence it was ruled by the Prince of Telflam. As of 1372, Nith is independent in name, but really the Shadow Masters of Telflam control it the same way they do Telflam. Nith is named after the creatures of the same name that used to dwell nearby on the western edge of the Forest of Lethir, which was much closer to Nith at the time. Long ago, the Prince of Telflam sent a cabal of wizards to kill all of them in order to protect the town, which they succeeded in, but many of them died in the process. Because of this, all arcane spellcasters are well respected in Nith, as long as they aren't wearing the robes of a red wizard, although many people of Nith believe spellcasters are fated to meet the same grisly end, likely when the Nith return to exact their revenge. Fent. Fent is a large town located where the route from Telflam to Nethentir splits from the Golden Way, serving as a major crossroads for traffic to and from Thay. As of 1372, several hundred orcs left behind by Zintelkeep reside in Fent, with many more working in small iron mines in the Thesk Mountains. At the end of each 10-day, these miners flood into town to sell ore and gather supplies, taking over Fent's taverns and alehouses. Although this often leads to damage and injuries, the townsfolk have learned when to intervene and when to avoid trouble. Phasant. Phasant is a large city and is the most popular rest stop between Telflam and Mulcentir. Second only to Telflam in power and influence, Phasant is the closest a city is to being Thesk's capital, and is the cultural center of the country. Phasant has the largest Shu town in Thesk, home to 5,000 Shu humans displaced by the Tuigan horde. They have assimilated well, and many Shu own successful businesses or have seats on the Merchant Council of Phasant. When the Shu migrated to Phasant, along with them came the secret society of the Nine Golden Swords, a criminal organization akin to the Yakuza, intimidating and extorting the people of the city. As of 1372, they stuck to their Shu Town district, but they had plans of exerting their power over the entire city, likely to the dismay of the Shadow Masters. Around 1400 DR, a Shu hero named Tai Xing drove the gangs of Phasant underground, becoming the first Council Lord of Phasant and the first suzerain of Thesk, before dying in 1453. As of 1479, a gang called the Black Dragons rule Phasant's underworld most of the time. Which begs the question, as of 1479, what are the Nine Golden Swords and the Shadow Masters doing in Phasant? Tamar. Tamar is a large town that lies between Kront and Nethentir. However, since the Cold Road is a more direct route between Kront and Nethentir, most of the traffic on this road is to Telflam. It was nearly razed to the ground during the Tuigan invasion. Then it was inhabited by bandits extorting exorbitant tolls on passing merchants. Eventually, Phasant hired a Zint orc army to clear it out. The orcs were hailed as heroes and helped rebuild the town. Telflam. To most people, Telflam is Thesk. Merchants travel to this port city to trade goods, but have no reason to go further into the country. To them, Telflam is the westernmost tip of Karatur. Telflam was founded by the Impilturan merchant Wendin Belindre, pioneering the Golden Way with his merchant company, the Royal Company of Chukhloma, and gave himself the title Merchant Prince. This title has been handed down to all his descendants, and as of 1372, Telflam was ruled by the merchant prince Wendrin Belindre. While ruled by a prince, Telflam was an independent principality that technically wasn't a part of Thesk, with the cities of Nith and Coalmaster under its control. Although it wasn't a part of Thesk, it was closely allied with them. Now, during this time, Telflam's prince did have a seat on the Council of Thesk, despite Telflam not being a member of Thesk, and while it was ruled by a prince and not an oligarchy, it still had a merchant council, just like the other cities. The Merchants' Council was described as a, quote, legislative and regulative body intended to balance power of the city's ruling prince and moderate the city's commerce, end quote. And they were said to have more power than the prince. So, I'm not exactly sure why it wasn't considered part of Thesk, since it seems to check all the marks that a city of Thesk has. They have a seat on the council, they have a merchant council, but maybe I was misreading that. Either way, the Shadow Masters were the ones really controlling the city, and to basically every outsider, they considered Telflam as a part of Thesk. So it was not a part of Thesk in name, but really it didn't matter. Eventually, the last scion of the Belindre family died, and Telflam became a true oligarchy, led by a merchant council just like all the other cities of Thesk. Now, whether or not it officially joined Thesk or if it stayed independent after this is unclear because this info is from 4th edition, and once again, as I state in all my videos, and this one multiple times, 4th and 5th edition like to keep lore extremely vague and not give me any of the information I want to know. Now, within Telflam, there are several notable locations. The first is its shoe town, which, just like a lot of the towns in Thesk, Telflam does have a shoe town, and it makes up about a quarter of the whole city. It uses architecture of Karatur, along with the best shoe restaurants and inns, and most of the people here are poor. Peasants, minor merchants, and of course the Yakuza of the 9 Golden Swords. I don't know why they called them Yakuza, because these are shoe humans from Chukhloma, and Chukhloma is most definitely based off Imperial China, but Yakuza is a Japanese word, so I don't know what's going on there. It feels like they just were mixing their Asian stereotypes, but I think this is a great example of why Ed Greenwood really didn't want real-world analogs in the Forgotten Realms. They did it anyway, and then you get stuff like Chinese Yakuza. But whatever, I'm not here to give my opinion, I'm here to give you the facts, and canonically, the 9 Golden Swords are called Yakuza. Castle Belindre. Castle Belindre is a fortified castle overlooking the waterfront where Prince Belindre ruled from. When the noble family died out, the head of the Merchant Council was given stewardship of this castle. The Merchant's Fortress. The Merchant's Fortress is a sprawling white stone complex perched atop the tallest hill in the center of Telflam, and is where the operations of the Merchant's Council are based out of. The prince controlled the city watch and militia, but each councillor had a private force. Over half of those armies were headquartered in the Merchant's Fortress, while the rest traveled along the Golden Way escorting caravans. The House of Master's Shadow. This is the hidden temple to Mask and the headquarters of the local thieves guild, the Shadow Masters of Telflam. The House of Master's Shadow looks like every other temple in the city except that it has no locks. Locks are pointless protection against most of their members, and people know better than to steal from the Shadow Masters. Local businesses. The business of Telflam is business. They have very few exports, but are known for their merchant emporiums, trading costers, and shipping agents. They are a gateway to the rest of Faerun for the exotic goods of the East, mainly silk, spices, smoke powder, and art. Telflam is also home to one of the oldest Thayan enclaves. It's located on a hill to the north of the city, a fortified structure enclosing several buildings and a 20-foot tall stone wall. They sell all sorts of Thayan goods, but they are most known for their discounted magic items, costing 10% less than market price. Major temples. Telflam has a temple dedicated to Shandakul, Joaquin, Tamora, and Tyr. It also has the Jiang Temple, an order of monks who train to fight with weapons along with their body. But I couldn't find any info on their beliefs, dogma, the gods they worship, or really anything other than the fact that they train how to fight. Moving on from Telflam, we have 2 Stars. 2 Stars is a large town situated at the crossing of the 2 most important trade routes in the Unapproachable East, the Golden Way and the Cold Road. It's not the largest town in the area, but more commerce passes through 2 stars than any other community in Thesk. It was named after the stars of the east and the west that meet in the sky overhead, and it's surrounded by 30-foot tall stone walls. Within 2 stars, there are a couple locations. Galady Castle, ruled by the Galady family, who impose a road tax on wagons passing through, 1% of the total worth of cargo. With the huge amount of caravan traffic coming through, this has made the Galadys the richest family in Thesk other than the merchant lords of Telflam. Their castle is an expansive structure that has both the Cold Road and the Gold Way crossing through its courtyard. Local businesses. 2 Stars' economy is based on serving the wants and needs of the merchants passing through. Anything that can be legally sold is. The Crossroads Inn is the most famous place in town, located within the Galady Castle courtyard on the northwest corner of the Crossroads. It was the first business built by Prasso Galady and is where the Galadys spend most of their time. There is a Thayan enclave in 2 Stars as well, selling most common magic items for 15% off the normal market price. There's also a place called the Seer's Eye, a shop of former adventurers selling their high-level spellcasting services. They include a former red wizard and both good and evil clerics. They can cast just about any spell on a 24 hours notice, as long as they can obtain the required material components. The most popular spellcasting is divinations to see if their caravans heading across the endless waste will be safe. Important temples. 2 Stars has many chapels but few temples. Most of these are inhabited by a single cleric that aids worshippers as they pass through. The exception is the Temple of Shandakul, the patron of travelers. Everyone passing through 2 Stars stops here to pay respects to the Rider of the Winds. Now, there are some other towns in Thesk that I haven't mentioned, and they won't each be getting their own section because there really just isn't that much info on them. Coalmaster and Thasselra are towns on the road from Telflam to Milvaroon. Coalmaster, like Nith, is technically independent from Thesk and under the control of Telflam, at least as of the 1300s DR when Telflam was still ruled by a prince. During the Tuigan invasion, the Pirates of the Sea of Fallen Stars took advantage of Telflam's injured economy and established black markets dealing in food and shelter here. This eventually led to Coalmaster becoming a safe harbor for pirates by 1359. Thasselra is built into the foothills of the Dragonjaw Mountains, and it is the first town you pass through when leaving Milvaroon by foot. Inkar is a town on the Golden Way between Fint and Phasant, and is described as a small city with many inns. Ethdale is a town north of Telflam, just south of Nith, and is composed of humans and halflings, with halflings making up a majority of the population. Because it's a mostly halfling town, they tend to not appear on human maps. I could only find 2 maps with Ethdale on it. This first one is from the Forgotten Realms Atlas, and then this next one is from the Forgotten Realms Interactive Atlas, except for some weird reason it's incorrectly labeled as Ethdi or Ethdai and not Ethdale. I also found a place on the 3rd edition map called Ethvale, which is an extremely similar name, and I couldn't find any lore on a town called Ethvale, so I thought maybe it was supposed to be Ethdale and it was a typo. However, it's quite far from where Ethdale is supposed to be, and I also found Ethvale on the 4th edition map of all of Faerun, so I'm pretty sure it's its own thing. However, I could find absolutely zero lore on this place, so if you know anything about it, please let me know. Speaking of zero lore, I also couldn't find any lore or any mention at all on Gref's Ferry, Zarthul, or Blackhill. They are listed on the 3rd edition map of Thesk from Unapproachable East, but I can't find them mentioned anywhere. In addition to all of these settlements I've talked about, there are people living outside the cities. Now, you do have farmers in the plains and you have miners in the mountains like I talked about previously, but there are also many nomadic tribes that run flocks in the Thesk mountains and the plains around them. In the aftermath of the Tuigan invasion, Thesk's economy was demolished, trade halted, and cities were ruined, and many Theskians returned to the nomadic lifestyle. And that is all the information I could find on the country of Thesk. If there's anything I missed or any little tidbit of information you'd like to mention, please let me know in the comments. I would love to know more about this place. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and remember to subscribe if you want more D&D related content.